Ladies and gentlemen, we'll all agree that we need to move toward more sustainable land use. What I will argue in this talk is that most solutions are already known. And actually, most solutions are already implemented in a few places in the world. The big challenge now is how to upscale what we already know. I will describe this in the context of tropical deforestation. Today, still about 8 million hectares of forest are being razed or burned every year. This is a major source of carbon dioxide emissions to the atmosphere, thereby contributing to global warming. It's the major cause of the loss of biodiversity. It affects the water cycle, soils, and many other ecosystem services. About 40% of the tropical deforestation is caused by the production of commodities that are exported worldwide, such as palm oil, soy, beef, and timber. Of course, as a response, there are many international policies to control deforestation. Let me go through 3 solutions for deforestation. One is what we call payments for ecosystem services. These are financial compensation for forest owners who agree to preserve their forest. Because they will sequester more carbon, protect more biodiversity, it's quite normal that they are compensated for this. In order to test whether this policy works, we conducted a very large-scale experiment in Uganda, just next to a major national park. We conducted a randomized controlled trial. We selected 120 villages, and they were randomly assigned to either treatment, where we had an intervention, or control, where we simply observed what was going on. The intervention was a visit to these villages, and we offered to every farmer a payment of $25 per hectare and per year if they would commit to conserve their forest. No punishment if they would not, simply an incentive if they would. For both the control and treatment villages, we analyzed very high-resolution satellite data from before and after the experiment. We used artificial intelligence techniques to map tree cover and observed, after only 3 years, that the rate of deforestation was decreased by more than 50% in the treatment villages as compared to the control villages. It's a very, very cheap way to slow down deforestation and maintain more carbon into the ground. Second solution. Many NGOs, scientific organizations have designed eco-certification programs. That is, they've defined a standard of sustainable land use, sustainable production practices. These are some examples for coffee production. If a farmer meets all these standards, and it's audited by a third party, by an independent body, then they can sell their coffee or their other commodities with an eco label, which receive a higher price, a price premium, and gives them access to a niche market. Does this work? We conduct another experiment. This time we went to Colombia. We select a large sample of farms, 474 of them, randomly. We first select farms that were eco-certified, that were working in one of these programs, and then we pair them, we try to match them with one of their neighbors that was not eco-certified. But because they were neighbors, that means they were living in the same biological conditions, same climate, same soil, same access to the market. And we also ensured that they had the same farm size and same level of education. Thereby, we could really control them again as treatment, eco-certified, and control. Every dot you see on this map is one of these farms. Again, we overlaid them on satellite data. We measured change in tree cover using the same techniques. And what we found is that the farms that are eco-certified in green here have much more reforestation, much more increase in tree cover compared to the farms that are not eco-certified. Because the standard requires them to produce coffee under agroforestry systems. Again, very simple solution, it works very well. Another example, we also work in Chile, where there the main issue is the clearing of natural forests, some forests that are very rich in biodiversity, for tree plantation, mostly eucalyptus and pine, which are very, very poor in biodiversity. This is what you see in these red patches that we mapped using satellite data. Again, we sample a very large data set with more than 4,000 properties across Chile, many companies. For every property, we know who is the owner, what they do, whether they are certified or not, who are they selling their timber to. With 3 time slice, before any eco-certification system, and you see a lot of red, which means there's a lot of conversion of forest into plantations. In 2001, these eco-certification programs were launched. We have another time series, and we see that over the following 10 years, you don't see any more red, which means that in these properties that were eco-certified, this practice of clearing primary forest for plantation disappeared. Again, it works very well. Third and last example of a solution to control deforestation. A number of private companies are making sustainable sourcing commitments. They commit to only buy raw material, crops, timber, from producers that meet some standards. And they help these producers to improve, to adopt more sustainable practices. For example, one of these companies is this retailer in South Africa. They gave us access to all the audit data of their own producers. Again, a very large number with about more than 200 farms over more than 9 years. Every year they do an audit. We analyze this data. We also create a control groups, farmers that are not selling their fruit to that company. And we find significant improvement in a number of practices. Some of them are legally required, and others relate to better soil management practices, water management practices. Again, these commitments by companies do have a very positive impact on land use. A few countries have combined many of these solutions, many of these small solutions in their policies. And as a result, they've been able to reverse deforestation. Look at Vietnam here with the time starting in 1900, so we have more than 1 century of forest cover data. This is the forest cover in Vietnam, from 0% forest to 70% forest in the country. The country experienced a very rapid decline in forest cover, but then in the early 90s, with new policies, they were able to reverse completely that trend. Not only to halt deforestation, but to move into what we call a forest transition, with a rate of reforestation twice as fast as the rate of deforestation we had before. Of course, I need to say that about half of that is natural regeneration of forest, and the other half are tree plantations, which of course in terms of biodiversity lead to much less benefits. An even better example is Costa Rica. Look at this. Deforestation, forest cover goes down, deforestation accelerates, and then boom, you have a very, very sharp reversal in deforestation, going to very, very rapid reforestation. In that case, with quite little plantation, mostly natural regeneration. That's quite impressive. Well, before we rejoice too much, I need to talk about leakage. Often in this very complex system, where you intervene somewhere, you have cascading effects elsewhere. And that's what happened. Let me give you 3 examples of leakage. First, in Vietnam. Vietnam had a logging ban, banned any logging of their forest. But just after that ban, if you would stand at the border between Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia, that's what you would see 24 hours a day. Huge import of timber that was harvested illegally in these countries into Vietnam. So basically, Vietnam was just offshoring part of its deforestation. We tried to quantify what exactly was this leakage. So we measured the amount of wood that was imported and what fraction of the reforestation in the country this was representing. It was about 40%, which means that reforestation story in Vietnam is a story of a glass that's 40% full, 60% full, and 40% empty. Still, let's take this 40%, right? We did the same kind of study in Bhutan, another forest transition country. We really thought Bhutan, as you know, this remote kingdom, very isolated in the Himalaya, with a long tradition of very closed economy, they would not leak, right? So we measured wood consumption in the country in green, and wood production in blue. And you see, every year, what they produce is more or less what they consume. They are self-sufficient in wood production. Until 2006, where Bhutan reinforced its forest policies. Therefore, they start to produce much less wood in blue, but consumption increased. How could this happen? Well, the only way is by importing wood for your neighbor, which is exactly what Bhutan was doing. They start to import a lot of their wood, mostly in the form of charcoal, from India. 40% of the wood consumption in Bhutan was coming from India. But in this case, it's maybe a good story, because in India, that wood was coming from sustainably managed forest plantations, while in Bhutan, it was coming from primary forests that are very rich in biodiversity. So in that case, it's maybe a good idea to get your wood from your neighbor. Third leakage story, slightly more complicated, this one. Costa Rica, they increased their tree cover in red here, mostly by abandoning all these pastures where they had beef production. Very, very low productivity. They had these extensive pastures with some beef there, some cattle. So rather than having this cattle production, they decided to mostly invest in very intensive fruit production. Pineapple, bananas, oil palms. These crops are intensive, therefore they yield much more value per hectare. And therefore they are sparing land for forest. If you can produce 3 times more per hectare, you need 3 times less land. And therefore you can save that land for forest. Something that no one had anticipated is that if you produce bananas and pineapples for export, you need to transport these fruits. And how are they transported? On wood pallets. The consumption of wood pallets to export all these commodities increased dramatically. Well, where do you get the wood for your pallets? Well, from your forest. The one that you planted by sparing land by intensification. Now you go back to this forest to export your fruit. It's another form of cascading effect through these sectors, from agriculture to forestry, that somehow cancels some of the benefits, only some of the benefits of your forest transition. So all these examples I've shown you tells us that there are solutions to deforestation. I call them small solutions because they only affect a few sectors, a few farmers. But these solutions tend to stay small. Yes, there are many payment for ecosystem services programs in the world, but in terms of value, money transfer, they only represent less than 0.1% of the value of international trade. Yes, there are many eco-certified products, but typically their market share is anywhere from 2 to 22%, and usually they stay there. Yes, there are very progressive companies with sustainable sourcing practices, but really it's something like 300 companies out of 80,000 large multinationals in the agribusiness sector. And yes, there are forest transition countries, but no more than a handful, 5 or 7. So if small is beautiful, big is necessary if we want to solve the problems. That's why my focus now is on the mechanism for upscaling these small solutions. The challenge, as we've seen, is not so much the speed of transformation. Remember the graph of Costa Rica. This happened really fast. The real challenge is the scale to achieve this transformation, not just at the scale of Costa Rica, but of the entire world. Many studies on upscaling have shown us that this is only successful if you design some coalitions, some collaborations between the public sector, civil society, and the private sector. If these sectors are antagonistic, there is no way we will solve these major problems. There's a need for these actors to agree to get together, pick one issue, and together solve it. There are two main pathways to upscale sustainability practices. One is when public policies support, endorse, integrate sustainability standards. Second is when private companies adopt in their internal code of conduct some of these sustainable practices. Let me give examples of these two pathways. First, the role of governments in producing countries. A number of countries where some of their companies, some of their producers had adopted some sustainable practices, decided at one point that this is working very well. This is good for the environment, this is good for these companies, they are profitable. So let's integrate these standards into the regulation. Let's make them public policy and thereby apply these practices to all the producers, not just the most progressive ones. There are many examples. Let me just give one. Bolivia in the 90s had a few logging companies that had concessions on public forest that were into the Forest Stewardship Council FSC certification standard. When Bolivia revised its forestry code in the 90s, it said, well, let's just copy-paste the FSC standard into public law with some adaptation. And therefore, let's apply this standard to all our producers, which happened very successfully. Until the government changed, and therefore they backtracked and moved back to forest clearing. Other example is Mozambique with the Better Cotton Initiative, which is a private standard for textile, which is now in public policy in Mozambique. There are some other examples. Because these commitments are largely dependent on the government in these countries, it needs to be complemented by another set of commitments by governments in consuming countries, the countries that are importing these commodities. Many countries in OECD countries have adopted green procurement policies. For example, the European Union has a major policy to fight against illegal timber trade. And they just recognize that any timber that is certified by the Forest Stewardship Council or the other system, PEFC, just meet the criteria of that policy. So thereby, they are pushing producers to get certified, and therefore they upscale this mechanism. Again, there are many other examples of large public policies that endorse private sustainability standards. The second pathways relate to private companies. Many companies have large commitments, develop some aspirational goals of decreasing their impact on the environment. And a large fraction of them actually, in order to implement these commitments, simply declare that they are only going to source materials that is meeting some certification criteria. When these companies concentrate a very large share of the global trade in one commodity, that leads to a very powerful upscaling mechanism. For example, about 80 to 90% of the global trade in palm oil is controlled by just 3 large multinationals, which means that when these 3 companies make a commitment and implement it, which is already the hard part, then you have solved 90% of the problem. More than 450 companies in the agribusiness sector have committed to remove deforestation from their supply chain by 2020 or by 2030. 2020, let's forget it. They are not going to do it. They are missing the target. 85% of these companies with these commitments rely on third-party certification in order to implement the commitment. Again, it's a very powerful upscaling mechanism. Other companies, like IKEA, for example, have made commitment that 100% of their wood will be FSC certified by 2020, and 100% of their textile will be certified by the Better Cotton Initiative. Big upscaling. We did a study on 450 companies listed on the stock market of some OECD countries in the food, wood, and textile sectors. We analyzed all their commitments as declared in their sustainability report on their website. We found that more than 50% of them were adopting some sustainable sourcing practices. About half. Again, is it a glass half full or half empty? You decide, but it's already something. And a third of these companies were relying on third-party certification. That means independent auditing to check whether or not they are complying. Which companies were making these commitments? Well, mostly companies with a very high brand value. They try to defend the reputation of their brand. Large companies, companies serving European markets, because that's where the greatest demand by consumers for sustainable products is nowadays. Consumer-facing companies, because that's where the consumer pressure is exerted. And interestingly, companies whose headquarters is located in a country where you have many NGOs, which means that civil society pressure does work. One of the major challenges is that whether we talk about companies, consumers, countries, we have a gradient from the very progressive actors that are inclined to be the leaders in sustainability because they are motivated by altruistic values, all the way to what we call the laggards, the companies behind that will always put short-term profit first. Many of the policies I've mentioned mostly appeal to the first group, to the progressive companies. So if we only rely on these voluntary market instruments, what we are doing, we make the virtuous companies even more virtuous. And we leave all the other ones behind, which creates a market differentiation between the kind of high-end companies for the European or OECD market, and then all the other ones that keep damaging the environment. So the real challenge is to move to this kind of model where you raise the floor for all companies through public policy. That's the only way to raise the bar. And in addition, you create incentives for the more progressive companies to be at the vanguard, to be the leaders in the movement. That is why it is so important to develop this, what we call hybrid governance, public plus private governance, to solve these problems. There's a great complementarity between public and private policies. For example, as I've described before, some government or private companies can simply absorb, integrate into their own policies some existing sustainability standard that has been developed by NGOs, roundtables, or some other actors. Another model is what we call the carrot and stick approach. You have the carrot, the incentive, market-based incentives for the leading companies. But then for the laggards, you need to raise the floor, and only the threat of sanction by public policies will do the job. In other case, the main role of the government is to create supportive conditions and enabling environment to facilitate adoption of new sustainable practices. And finally, in some cases, government, private sector, NGO divide the tasks of policy implementation. The government will set the agenda, companies will invest in innovation, the financial world will put the money, the NGO world will do the monitoring, and informally, of course, they never sit at the table to divide these tasks, but informally, they create this policy ecosystem that is lifting the whole system on a more sustainable trajectory. I think I told you 4 things. First, of course, we need all these small solutions. But we also need this upscaling mechanism to create this system-wide change and not just this niche market improvement. This can only be done through synergies between different initiatives, some voluntary, public policies that are more command and control, and also some private commitment through the supply chains, mostly for the very large private sector. It is crucial for this sustainability transition to promote public-private partnerships, multi-stakeholder initiatives, which is another word for the same thing, hybrid governance, where multiple actors collaborate to solve an issue rather than be antagonistic, as it's too often the case. And as we do that, we need to integrate the heterogeneity between actors. On any market, we will have to deal with very progressive actors, but also with laggards. And they will each respond to very different signals. Thank you very much.